Hi, this is Tracey Tokuhama-Espinosa. Thank you for the opportunity to share some ideas about neuroconstructivism in the modern classroom. We're going to look at some new ideas that come out of neuroscience today, and we're going to combine this with an understanding of the role that technology is now playing in our understanding of how to best teach children and how to best teach adults. And we'll specifically take a look at this in the context of language learning. We'll do this under the umbrella concept of neuroconstructivism, how the brain constructs new learning and how those new connections are built up over time and over the lifespan. Then we'll look at a specific example of how we can leverage technology to fill in gaps in knowledge that might be necessary to have that neuroconstructivism successfully take place. It's wonderful to say that we know much more about the brain than ever before in the history of humanity. However, we know very little. So take all of these suggestions and information with a grain of salt, okay? In the history of brain imaging, we've grown from, these drawings that were done by Da Vinci to the Human Connectome Project, which is much more detailed in its understanding of how the brain actually works. And this is all thanks to advances in technology. Different imagings are helping us understand, not only in time but also in space, a more precise understanding of exactly what occurs when the brain does learn. And we can now see this at the level of synapses and how those connections are occurring in the brain that provide the foundation for those neural pathways in the brain. One of the best things to come out of this information is getting rid of a lot of the myths, neuromyths that exist about the brain. Hopefully those things are put to rest and we now don't rely on those things when we choose methodologies in our teaching in our classroom. We now have this more sophisticated understanding of how learning occurs and this complex understanding of neural networks as opposed to just believing in localizationalism or that, X piece of knowledge is located in Y place in the brain. Now we understand that this is a very complex thing that occurs through multiple neural pathways. We'll see an example of that when we talk about reading in just a minute. A lot of this information was born out of the efforts of the OECD countries, and starting in 2002 and then published again in 2007, trying to categorize the types of information that teachers are exposed to. So there's information that's well established, there's information that's probably so, there's information that is just basically intelligent speculation. It seems like it would be logical, but there really is mixed evidence behind that. Or things that are just myths. And unfortunately, there's a lot more myths out there than there are things that are well established. If I were to ask you in a quick quiz to answer these questions, what would you say? Human brains are as unique as human faces. What does this mean? Can we draw an analogy between the brain structure and the face? Well, let's think. You have two eyes, you have a nose, you have a mouth, you have two ears. Let's say that your parts are the same, but do your faces look the same? Probably not. Not even identical twins have similar brains. When it comes down to twins, their faces might look the same, but still their brains are not the same. And this is all really based on their unique experiences. No two individuals will perceive the information in the same way because all new learning passes through the filter of prior experience. So since none of us have identical experiences in life, we will react to new information in slightly different ways. How about this one? Past information influences how we learn something new. Absolutely. The more you know, the more you can know, the more you can link new ideas. So just the basic physiology of how information comes into the brain does not permit you not to have a first filter through prior experience. Stimulus will be received through your sensory perception and then it will go into the brain, and the first stop is a big check with the amygdala and the second big stop has to do with the hippocampus. So it's always comparing prior knowledge with what is new. This is basically survival. The human brain is economizing its learning by trying to figure out if what I'm presented with is like anything I already know, because it's effort to learn new things, right? If I were to ask you then, how many times do you need to see something new before you learn it? What would your answer be? Would you say, oh, I just need to see something once, or 5 times is enough, I can remember everything, or 7 times, or 10 times, or 30 times, or 50 times? Or would you be smart enough to say, you know what, it depends. It depends. Individuals need different amounts of exposure to new concepts, basically because of prior experience. If you already know, for example, how to add, I can teach you how to subtract in about 10 goes. It'll take you about 10 different exposures to that information, rehearsal, correction, before you understand subtraction. But let's say you have gaps in your understanding of addition. This means it will take you much longer to learn subtraction. This is this hierarchy of knowledge that if you don't have that basic knowledge, you won't be able to build on top of that. And this is Robert Marsano's work. He indicates that it can take, upward 50 times before you actually learn a new concept if you have no prior experience with that information. This means that the kids in our classes are going to differ greatly in their ability to learn new information based on their prior experience. If we go into now to this idea of constructivist theory and neuroconstructivism, constructivism, you might have heard some of these names before, right? These people established this idea that human beings construct knowledge based on their environments. Based on the experiences they have, they take the different pieces and they build off of those to construct their understanding of the world. In the most simple sense, then you'd have an experience, you have prior understanding of something, you've seen something, smelled something, done something. And when you have a certain combination of that, that can allow you to know something else. The more you know, the more you can know, right? Then you have an additional piece of information that can grow these ideas. So basically you're building a firm foundation upon which you can build new knowledge. Von Glaserfeld pointed out that there's this other concept of radical constructivism, which means that it's just not the experiences you have, but it's also your past experiences influence the way you will react to the new experience and what you will indeed connect those past ideas to, or the new ideas with the past ideas. So it is a very highly individualized process. Constructivism is something that happens at an individual level based on your prior experiences, as well as how the information is presented and how it is connected explicitly in instruction. Neuroconstructivism, then, if we sum up these ideas of basic constructivism and what we do now know about the brain, neuroconstructivism, then, is a theoretical framework that focuses on the constructive of representative knowledge in a hierarchical way in the brain. So the brain is actually creating certain connections for base knowledge before it goes on to higher order thinking. This may sound like a pretty logical understanding, but it really wasn't discussed or proven until about 2006, 2007, 2008. We began to have a lot more publications in this field. Why? Because it's highly complex. And neuroconstructivism is not just what's happening at the neuronal level, but it's highly influenced by different types of activity, different types of cognitive functions, your subjective interpretation of information based on your individual experience, and overall the general environment. So it's very hard to track and to say this is a normal development of neuroconstructivism because of the unique nature of learning in each individual. So the bottom line, what's most important to take out of this is that certain basic knowledge needs to be in place before higher order thinking can occur. And this has to do with all structured neural pathways in the brain. So if we think about networks, if we think about this in a network context, if we look at things like language in general, we know that language has various sub-elements, subdomains. For example, language is also made up of reading and writing, speaking and listening. But reading, for example, also has other subdomains which are created these pathways. For example, word recognition or phoneme decodification that turns into words. And then this produces then observable behavior. We can see things that we now know occur at multiple levels within the brain. So while it might appear to be a simple single element, a child can read, when we look at the brain level, when we talk about neuroconstructivism, it's far more complex than that. There's multiple levels. So what are some of the neural pathways for reading? I tried to document this and found that there were at least 16 different neural pathways before the brain can read fluently. You have to be able to see words, you have to be able to pay attention to them, you have to have working memory in order. Within working memory, you have something that's called the phonological loop. Additionally, we have symbol system knowledge, understanding what a cursive A looks like as compared to a capital A, as compared to a small a, is a different neural pathway. As is phonemes. Turning those different symbols into phonemes and turning those phonemes into words is a different neural pathway that is different from putting it all together. How do you learn a new word? Reading also implies things like semantic retrieval. Do I understand the meaning of this particular word? That we also know from Dehane's work that there's a letterbox or a word form area in the brain which has to do with visually interpreting that word, then connecting it back to the meaning of that word, and then in the context that that word is being read. Semantic understanding, understanding the definition of the word and the multiple definitions that a single word might have, is a different neural pathway, for example, than retrieving that word. So knowing how to store it is a different process than actually retrieving that word. This is also different from syntactic understanding, understanding that time flies like an arrow and fruit flies like bananas. The syntactic structure helps us understand the semantic understanding of the word. And the context also changes that. Context and intonation are in another part of the brain. You see a lot of heavy right frontal lobe activity if you say the words, I'm pregnant. You say, I'm pregnant, or I'm pregnant. You can say the same words. Syntactically, we've got the same structure, but because of the intonation, you have a far different meaning. Understanding that is a different neural pathway in the brain. And when kids are learning to read, for example, it makes a lot of difference if they understand the intonation, the correct intonation. Putting all of those pieces together, then you get sentence comprehension, which is very complex. And you can add on to this and say, okay, what is paragraph comprehension? Sentences are smaller ideas. When you put multiple ideas together, you can get a concept, which is in a paragraph, right? So how do you join all of those things to make a logical understanding of the words? In addition to these neural pathways related to sub-areas of language, there are also emotional, social, affective angles to learning a language. How a person feels about the learning process. Do they have good self-esteem in general? Have they had good experiences learning? Are they a good learner in general? And they can feel that they can learn anything, even something as challenging as learning to read, for example, in another language. Or how the learning impacts their social status. If they are told, oh, you're such a nerd, they might not want to learn a skill set because it excludes them from a social group, right? The relationship between the teacher and the learner is highly important, as are other motivational factors. So we know that all of those things, again, are distinct neural pathways in the brain. So language processing as a whole is very, very complex. And there's more research that's been done on reading networks in the brain than there is, for example, of writing. There are multiple studies that between the difference between your brain reading something out loud versus reading in silent way, or understanding, reading new words versus something that you've had repeated experience with. So a good reader's brain looks fairly inactive compared to a new reader's brain who's trying to find out strategies and try to look for those complete pathways. And there is a difference between reading yourself and being read to in the brain. So listening circuits versus reading circuits are distinct in the brain. And the very few studies that do exist on writing in the brain really show us something pretty amazing. Writing occupies more distinct neural pathways than probably any other human activity that we've witnessed. And writing has an additional sub-element where we are asked to produce spelling. That's a lot different from reading. Reading, you can quickly recognize when things are misspelled or not. When you have to generate that yourself, you don't have that cue set of seeing something, out there. When you write it and you can say to yourself, okay, I think that looks incorrect. But reading is a much faster process in identifying misspellings than writing would be. And we now know that humans have this wonderful, unique ability to learn more than one language. And this is thought to be now mediated by functionalism, not rather structuralism. So it means that your brain doesn't physically change in structure, rather that the function of those neural pathways is enhanced or slightly changed, but the physical structure of the brain is not sacrificed or changed in any way due to multilingualism or bilingualism. Studies in neurolinguistics show the benefits of bilingualism, which are really clear. Bilingual children have a higher level of abstraction than monolinguals. They learn to manage language rules quicker than monolinguals. And they learn to inhibit information, inhibit stimuli that's not productive when producing language. They learn that faster than monolinguals. And if they learn languages after a certain age, after early childhood, they are using more of their brains. A child brought up bilingual from birth will basically be using the exact same neural pathways as a monolingual child. But a child more or less 7 months of age onward is actually using different neural pathways. Depending on the typology of the language and the age of acquisition, you'll find different types of neural pathways which tend to be more active than a monolingual's brain would be. This does not encroach or take away from other skill set areas. You can learn multiple languages and it has no effect on other area of learning like math or to be an artist or to understand historical facts, for example. So in general, the bottom line, according to Laura Ann Petito at Harvard and her research looking at multiliteracy skills, is that there's absolutely no disadvantages. And in fact, she finds quite positive effects on children 7, 8 years old learning to read in another language. It does add benefits, which are specifically related to a topic we're not going to have time to discuss, but it has to do with expanded executive functions, which have to do with working memory ability, cognitive flexibility, and inhibitory control. Other studies highlight the great importance, for example, of symbol system recognition. Bilingual aphasics are a fascinating group of studies because of the alphabets in Japanese, the katakana, hiragana, the romanji, and the kanji. Different people who have different types of strokes suffer in different ways with a consequence to the different language structures. Believe it or not, there is a special kind of aphasic, which is just someone who might lose just kanji, for example, or just retain kanji. They can lose katakana and hiragana, but they would just lose kanji. This has to do with the different symbolic interpretation of kanji as opposed to katakana, hiragana, which are very similar to romanji, which don't have a direct sound correlation to a concept. They are more related to phonemes as they are to conceptual understanding. So if you were to summarize all this information to say, okay, so where is language in the brain? It's easier, far easier to say what parts of the brain are not used in language than in what parts of the brain are used in language, let alone bilingualism or multiliteracy skills. And the bottom line with culture is that your brain adapts to what it does most. So this is something very important to take into consideration in our classroom settings. When you're teaching people who come from a different cultural background, and as you all very well know, teaching methodologies and their success varies drastically based on the cultural context. To sum up this idea then of neuroconstructivism, I'd like to throw in one last idea which has to do with a pillars concept of language. And this is that there's nothing learned that is not either a symbol, a pattern, order, categories, or a relation. If you think of all the concepts of language, for example, when a child learns to read a sentence, first they have to understand the symbol systems, they have to understand the patterns in a correct sentence, which is the order as well. They have to understand categories of words, these are verbs, these are nouns, and the relationships. Well, we also know that the adjectives always follow the nouns or go before them, whatever the rules might be. So this is another way of seeing how your brain actually structures and orders this in a very logical way. So going from lower level symbolic understanding up to the higher order symbolic understanding does happen in a developmental way over time. Far more important than the age of an individual, for example, in learning a foreign language, is the order in which those different elements are constructed in that individual's brain. So again, the core idea of neuroconstructivism is that there's basic neural pathways need to be in place before other higher order thinking can be put into functioning. So some three big ideas. There are multiple neural pathways needed to achieve any task. So if we talk about language in general, if we talk about reading specifically, we know that there's all these multiple foundations that have to be in place before a child can reach that level of reading, or before an adult can reach a level of multiliteracy skills. Not only in symbolic understanding, but also understanding the patterns of the different language, understanding certain orders or ordered concepts of grammar, for example. The relationship between different concepts and the categorization of different elements need to be clearly understood in this hierarchical level before you can put it all together and learn to read, for example. This also explains why, in order to be a great writer, you really have to be a great reader. The key point here is that teachers have to attend to all of these different levels. So you might have a chapter in a book that says it's time now to teach the past tense, but if you have a student who has very weak foundations in understanding the present tense, getting him to understand the past tense is going to be far more difficult. So you have to have strong foundations at each level before you can advance in language learning concepts. We also know that the individual brain constructs knowledge based on the combination of his or her genetics, what do you inherit, and what is involved in the environment, what culture do you live in. So this is the whole nature via nurture concept. Understanding an individual's background can give you some hints as to what they have the potential to learn within your class. Third and finally, each brain is unique, and it has different amounts of exposure to different concepts before it reaches you in your classroom. So there may be somebody who walks into your class and you're about to do the unit on the past tense and they already know it. They've been exposed to it, just knew it, right? So that student will need fewer amounts of repetition of that concept before he gets it. However, there may be somebody else who comes to the class who has absolutely no idea, doesn't get it, or they have flaws even present tense, so they shouldn't go on to the past tense until they actually have that. So there is a hierarchy of skills that's necessary and that should be presented in a specific order. One way that we can take advantage of technology to do this is an example I'd like to share very briefly of a class that we just finished teaching in the Harvard Extension School on the neuroscience of learning and introduction to mind-brain health and education. In this class, we used something that we called bundles. These were mini libraries of information. Why was this important? When the students enter in the class, they see the main homepage, and from there, they can look at what happens in each week. So in these 16 weeks of classes, we had 33 different bundles, multiple bundles in some of these different weeks, and what the students would receive would be instructions. So in a basic structure of the class, they're exposed to the main topic, they're given the big idea of that week's focus, and then these specific assignments. Please take this quiz, do the discussion board question, watch the free weekly video before the live class, and visit the bundle. What happens in the bundle that makes a difference? When they're asked to go to visit the bundle, they'll see three different things. The first thing that they'll see is general instructions. In the weekly slides or videos, this is usually an obligatory video of about an hour long, and this also primes them for things that they don't already know. They have questions by the time they've watched this video. In having those questions, they can then go deeper into the bundle. And they can look at the instructor picks. The instructor says, we recommend these particular resources. And if you get through all of these and are still interested, here's a lot more detailed information about the same concept. So they can go further, deeper into the information as they like. What does this mean? In the first instance, it allows all learners to begin their learning or their understanding of the new weekly concept at their level. It also provides them with different levels of entry to the topic. So we have in the bundle some things as simple as a cartoon, a 14-second cartoon, or we have a 15-minute TED Talk, or you have a 4-hour-long lecture by a Nobel Prize explaining the same concept. We also have different levels of articles. All of them are peer review, but some of them are lighter in information, less technical, and some of them are far deeper in the information. So we create these very different levels of entry points so that every individual, independent of their prior knowledge, some of those kids who have weak prior knowledge, they can go in and start from zero and build up their knowledge. Whereas those people who might have come into the class and know a lot about this particular topic can go deeper into the information. Because there are sometimes 60, 70 different items in the bundle, most students will never exhaust all of the resources, but they will have the opportunity to begin their understanding of their information at their own starting point, where they think they need to address their own needs. What does this do? This creates the opportunities for the learners as they watch the first weekly video and they see the main topic and they realize, I have all these gaps in my understanding. I took the quiz and I got half of these things wrong. What do I need to reinforce? So it allows the learner to identify their own gaps in understanding and use the bundles to fill in those gaps. It also allows them to shine during the live class because they've had the opportunity to prep before they come to the live class where they have to share. They can say, oh yes, as the Deutsch video said, whatever. They can share case studies, they can share information, and they can come off as being mini experts in this field as well, even though they might have come in with zero understanding of that concept. This means the bundles are the place where that student who needs 50 or more repetitions of information, they can go and do that there. And this also means that the student who only needs one review of the information can do that there, and then go more deeply into the information. So everybody starts where they need to start, but everybody comes to the classroom with at least this minimal knowledge. What does this do? This allows the teachers to have a common starting point for beginning the class. We never presume that all the learners are at the same level. We do give them the resources so that they can come to the class and we can have a minimum starting point. We can presume that they all know this level of information by the time they get to the live class. This helps immensely in the motivational level of the individual students because it serves precisely the goal of the Goldilocks effect, right? Remember the three bears? This bed was too hard, this bed was too soft, and this one was just right. Well, this means this class isn't too hard, this class isn't too easy, this class is just right for all of the students who participate and take advantage of the resources available to them. So what does this mean in the global context of our teaching and how teaching has changed? Your job description has changed. Before we used to focus a lot on how to teach. Do you know how to teach? And we also then emphasize, make sure you know what to teach. Do you really know how to teach English, for example? But now we've added on this additional element of affective connection to the learner. So it's not only knowing your subject matter, knowing how to teach English, and it's not only knowing how to teach in general pedagogical knowledge, but you also have to know that individual student. What motivates him, what scares him, what makes him anxious. If we don't understand those affective elements, then we will have more difficulties in our classroom. But added to this now, this final element now, thanks to technology, is now we not only want people to have content knowledge, and we want them to have pedagogical knowledge. We want them to have pedagogical content knowledge, but we also want them to know how to leverage technology in their favor to be able to teach and take advantage and to have better and stronger student learning outcomes. So what did we do? We looked at some of the brief history, very briefly, of neuroscience and where we are today at knowing very little, but more than ever before, about the human brain and how it learns best. We've looked at the influence of technology in our understanding about the brain, as well as our more refined understanding of pedagogy, what really influences student learning outcomes. We tried to look at this in the context of a specific example of foreign language learning, and under this umbrella concept of neuroconstructivism, how the individual brain builds off of base pieces of knowledge to get higher order concepts in place, and how that is now the teacher's role to understand what is that order of concepts that needs to be taught. And finally, we closed by looking at an example of how we can leverage technology through what we call bundles, these mini libraries, to provide multiple entry points for the students so that the teacher can devote himself to teaching, not to trying to fill in the gaps of one individual when they come to the live class, but rather before the live class, the students have been exposed to multiple entry points of information so that we can all share a common starting point and dig deeper into the information. This flipped construct in a synchronous class has proven to be very successful in at least the pilot that we ran last semester. We hope that more of you will attempt to use a similar structure and let us know how it goes. There are multiple other ways you can use the bundles. Many teachers use them as their resources or as their course archives. So they create, for example, links. If a kid really just can't get it, your students are blowing the past tense and irregular verbs in English. Okay. Then go in, you can use something like the Khan Academy or other videos that are already prepared that allow that person to rehearse. You realize this is some guy that's going to need 50 repetitions. So you can suggest to that student, I'm going to differentiate your homework. Everybody should do at least 10 of these. I want you to do 50 of these so that you can come in with that rehearsal point so that when we're in the class together, you've now dominated that sub-skill of language that's necessary. I'm sure that many of you who are already great teachers already employ many of these techniques. Thank you for the opportunity to share the way we've incorporated this into our class. If you have any questions, do not hesitate to let me know. I'm always here to support you, and thank you very much for the opportunity to share.